I think everybody needs somebody in their life who is a person of grace, but who can be very direct, who believes in you, and maybe they believe in you more than you believe in yourself, but they don't hold back when they're direct. They don't beat around the bush, and yet you know that what they say is really comes from a heart and a mind of grace. This is, I think, part of how Paul was. And when he writes Timothy, you especially, in the beginning of this letter of First Timothy, you have a real clear impression that there is a tender affection that Paul has for Timothy, and I think for Timothy for Paul. But boy, when it's time to be direct, man, he goes for it. And in chapter 4, he's very direct. This is not any criticism against Timothy, but it's an alert, a warning for him. And we've talked about it before, last time, in fact, that Paul was saying, there are going to be people who will abandon their faith, and they will exchange the truth. This is my paraphrase. They will exchange God's design and direction in their lives for the demonic. And he picks it up in verse 2. We pick it up in verse 2. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars. We talked about that last time. Hypocrisy, gosh, there's nothing new about that. My dad was a preacher all of my growing up years. And then he got a master's degree in counseling and he had been counseling people because he just was that kind of guy that you wanted to tell your troubles to, right? So he went back to the university and got a master's degree at Oklahoma State. And then counseling began to emerge as the best place for him to focus his resources and talents and to steward his life. Long story, but eventually he got into and became a certified drug and alcohol counselor. And you can only imagine the need for that never gets small. And I don't think it's going away. Well, anyway, before he did all that, when he was in preaching, he occasionally would talk about people. He said, I'm not, why would I have time for church? It's just full of hypocrites. And he would say two things. First thing he would say was, well, that's true, but there's always room for one more. You ought to come join us. And then sometimes he would say, gee, man, I hate it that you're kind of hiding behind the hypocrite to stay out of church. Now, there are a lot of things wrong with that line of thought. And yet there's some truth there. Hypocrisy is a disease. And it is a communicable disease. I don't know if you've ever been part of a situation where the emotional climate is set by one or more individuals in the setting, specifically in the church, and the rest of the church kind of tends to, kind of magnetize toward that. This is very true of hypocrisy. When there are hypocrites teaching, they can sustain that for a little while, but eventually the truth comes out. And when the truth comes out, It will not be sanitary. It will be messy. Churches have been decimated by hypocrites who have been hiding their hypocrisy. See, here's the thing about hypocrisy. It's always hidden. You are always in the mode of hiding something about your life and your behaviors, your patterns and habits, or else you would be authentic rather than hypocritical. You know that the Greek term for hypocrisy, was the same term that was used for the actors in the stage productions in Greek and Roman culture. Now, they were not like our actors and stage performers. Well, they were in one sense. They acted out a script, but they used a mask over their face to represent the character that they were representing. And this one who holds the mask, that's where we get the word hypocrisy from. And people who hide behind a mask of propriety and honesty, but they hide. What are they hiding? Well, most often what they're hiding is some kind of behavior that stems from a belief, and emotions are all mixed up into that. But these behaviors, they break with God's design. In fact, most often, they break with what they are on a crusade against. It's incredible. Well, okay. Hypocritical liars. That's what hypocrites do. I mean, this is like birds fly, fish swim, hypocrites lie. If all of us would be wise, and I'd be at the front of this line, to look into our own lives and discern any level of hypocrisy. I want to mortify, I want to put to death any kind of hypocrisy. I want, there's a few things that I feel real strongly ought to be part of people's experience in God's family. The first thing is, it ought to be safe enough for me to disclose to the right people in an appropriate way and time and place the things I struggle with. These are the things that hypocrites try to hide. Authentic people they don't hide them. The safety of God's family. When God's people are authentic and loving, pardon me, and fueled by grace, they're safe. See, grace people, you'll find that grace people, real grace people, are safe to disclose things that you don't really want anybody to know. Pardon me. You probably have experienced this if you've got any history in the church, that you thought someone was a grace person and safe. You disclosed something that how do I say it? That something you would really rather keep hidden. You disclose that to them, and the next thing you know, how did other people find out about this? Or they turn on you, and all of a sudden they're not grace people anymore. Okay. Hypocritical liars. When they are at the front, when they have the lectern, so to speak, or the pulpit. Wow. Bad things happen. Paul, such teachings, these are demonic teachings, come from hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared as with hot iron. Now, obviously, since the year AD 60 something, when Paul wrote this letter to Timothy, medicine has come a long ways. Can we all, well, duh. Okay, here's the deal, though. There are still times when surgeons will sear some form of flesh as part of a legitimate procedure. Why? Basically what they're doing is killing it off and sealing it. This searing, in Paul's day, an open wound was very dangerous. I mean, they didn't have any antiseptics, and they had salves and ointments, but no antiseptics. I mean, okay, all right, let's think clearly about this. Germ theory didn't even come into play in medicine until well after the Civil War. Okay, so actually the whole story of that is very intriguing, but I'm not going to, burn off the time to tell it. But when a person sears their conscience, it's so that it will not, it will deaden. And Paul writes, seared with a hot iron. Okay, so he's drawing a pretty clear and dramatic word picture, that's how an open wound would often be treated. They would put some kind of a iron implement into the fire until it glowed red, and they would put it on. Can you imagine how harsh this would have been? They put it on the wound, it sears it and closes it. Of course, it leaves a horrible scar later, but when people sear their conscience, they're deadening their conscience. Now, I've talked about conscience, and it's one of my favorite topics to explore is the development of conscience. We're all given as a gift from God I think it is latent from the time our brain is formed in our mother's womb. It begins to develop once we're born and we encounter experience. And these experiences, what we do about our experience, educates our conscience. In its best form, our conscience cues us to know what is right and what is wrong intuitively and generally. So when a person sears their conscience as with a hot iron, so you don't accidentally do that, okay? When a conscience is seared, it is done by intention. It is educated to reject the instinctive division here between right and wrong, and educated it toward accepting what on an intuition level, on an instinct level, it wouldn't ever accept. It's always been this way. Everybody has educated their conscience, and I think it's safe to say everybody has educated their conscience away from certain things that had been instinctively right or wrong. And it's not always evil. But when the conscience is seared, Paul has no positive implication for this. The only way that a person would be able to continue in this hypocritical lying, these doctrines of demons, is if they were, if they had seared their conscience. That's the only way they can maintain it. Okay, I'm going to come back next time to this idea, because we got to think about, what do we do about this? That's next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.